This is the moment China realized it had been building its entire future on someone else's water. Not the moment oil prices broke 130 a barrel. Not the moment Beijing's foreign ministry called the American move dangerous and irresponsible. Not the moment Chinese-owned tankers started turning around in the middle of the Gulf of Oman with nowhere to go. This is a different moment, a structural one, the kind that does not end when the shooting stops. At exactly 10 a.m. Eastern Time on Sunday, April 26, 2026, the United States Navy activated a full blockade of Iranian ports and coastal areas across the Arabian Gulf and Gulf of Oman. Within hours, Brad Cooper, commander of U.S. Central Command, confirmed that the blockade had been fully implemented using more than a dozen Navy ships, fighter jets, and over 10,000 troops. 6 merchant vessels were ordered to turn back on the first day alone. The strait, which had barely been breathing after weeks of war, went completely silent. China, sitting 4,000 miles away in Beijing, felt it immediately. In this deep dive, we are going to show you exactly what the United States just did, why Beijing had no answer ready, what it is costing China every single day this continues, and most importantly, why this moment does not end when Hormuz reopens. Because the damage being done to China right now is not just economic, it is architectural. The entire energy model that powered China's rise for the last 4 decades has just been exposed as a critical weakness, and the country that exposed it did so in under 36 hours. The United States did not just blockade an Iranian port, it permanently changed what it means to be China. For 40 years, China built the greatest economic machine the world had ever seen, and it ran on a very simple assumption. Middle Eastern oil would always flow. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow 21-mile channel between Iran and Oman, would always be open. And whoever controlled that strait politically would never be in a position to use it against China directly. The plan was elegant in its ambition. China would become the world's factory, the world's manufacturer, the world's infrastructure builder. It would need enormous amounts of energy to do all of that. And instead of building expensive domestic energy independence, it would simply buy what it needed from the cheapest and most reliable source available, which was the Middle East. Specifically, Iran. The plan was to lock in discounted Iranian crude at a scale no other country could match, build refinery infrastructure calibrated around that specific type of oil, and use the relationship with Tehran as a geopolitical buffer against American pressure. It was supposed to deliver permanent energy security at a fraction of the cost of building it from scratch. But the hidden cost was never really about price per barrel. It was about exposure. By 2026, China was importing 1.4 million barrels of Iranian oil every single day. That was more than 80% of everything Iran exported by sea. China had become not just Iran's largest customer, but Iran's only real customer. And roughly a third of China's total oil supply, including non-Iranian sources, was traveling through the Strait of Hormuz. China's external dependence on crude oil had reached 72.7% of total consumption. Chinese economists and energy planners inside the National Development and Reform Commission had warned for years that this level of concentration in a single choke point was dangerous. Their memos went up the chain. The warnings were acknowledged, and then the next round of discounted Iranian crude contracts was signed anyway, because the short-term economics were simply too good to walk away from. China gambled that the United States would never directly blockade a waterway that would hurt its own allies as much as it hurt Beijing. That American military power would be used as a threat, not as a fully deployed instrument of economic warfare against Chinese supply chains. China assumed wrong. At 6 a.m. Beijing time on April 14, 2026, the screens inside China's National Energy Administration headquarters were showing something that analysts there had run scenarios about for years, but had never actually expected to see in real life. The vessel tracking data for the Strait of Hormuz showed almost nothing moving. The Chinese-flagged and Chinese-chartered tankers that had been slowly resuming tentative transits during the brief ceasefire window were frozen. Some had already turned around. Some were sitting in holding patterns in the Gulf of Oman, waiting for instructions that had no good answer attached to them. One of those vessels was the Rich Starry, a medium-range Chinese-owned tanker sanctioned by the United States for dealing with Iran, carrying 250,000 barrels of methanol. It made it through the strait on the first day of the blockade, but it was one of the last. Within 24 hours of the blockade going fully operational, the flow had stopped. While those tankers were going dark in the Gulf, something else was happening simultaneously in China's refinery sector. Chinese refineries, particularly the independent operators known as teapot refineries in Shandong province, which had built their entire business model around cheap Iranian crude, began sending emergency supply requests to state-owned energy companies. The specific grade of oil they needed, the Iranian heavy crude their equipment was calibrated to process, was no longer arriving. Switching to a different grade is not a simple mechanical adjustment. It requires retooling, new contracts, higher costs, and weeks of reduced operational capacity. While the refineries were scrambling, a third problem was already detonating inside China's financial system. The daily charter rate for oil tankers in the region had surged 584% from pre-war levels. The voyage from the Middle East to China, which normally travels through the strait, was being rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, adding 40% to the total distance and extending delivery times by 10 to 14 days. Insurance premiums for war risk coverage on Gulf tankers had gone from fractions of a percent to numbers that made some routes economically unworkable. Pause. 3 simultaneous shocks. The supply chain frozen. The refinery system scrambling for replacement grades. The logistics costs exploding. And on top of all of that, oil was trading at approximately $130 per barrel, up roughly $60 from pre-conflict levels. China, which imports over 10 million barrels of seaborne crude every single day, was now paying for a crisis it had spent 4 decades telling itself would never come. The International Monetary Fund had already cut its global growth forecast to 3.1% for 2026, down from 3.3%, and warned the world was drifting toward an adverse scenario where 100 per barrel oil became the new normal. For China, the math was even harsher than the global average. According to sources familiar with internal discussions inside Beijing's top energy policy bodies, the mood in the days after the blockade was activated was not panic. It was something more controlled and more alarming than panic. It was the quiet recognition that the scenario they had always told themselves was manageable had arrived, and the tools they had prepared to manage it were not quite reaching far enough. China's official position, delivered by Foreign Ministry spokesman Guo Jiakun at a Tuesday press conference, was measured and diplomatic. He called the blockade a dangerous and irresponsible act, and said it would only exacerbate tensions. He called on all parties to abide by the ceasefire arrangements and restore normal traffic in the strait as soon as possible. But what was happening behind that diplomatic language was a different conversation entirely. Leaks from energy sector sources inside Beijing describe a rapid emergency review of China's strategic petroleum reserve, which had been sitting at approximately 1 billion barrels going into the crisis. That sounds like a large number. At China's current consumption rate and with Middle Eastern supply effectively cut, analysts were calculating that the reserve, even in a managed drawdown scenario, provided roughly a few months of buffer before structural supply problems began affecting industrial production. Sources familiar with PetroChina's internal communications say that Dai Huliang, the company's chairman, was tasked with publicly reassuring the market that the company's exposure through Hormuz was limited. His statement that PetroChina's Hormuz transiting imports were only about 10% of total operational volume was technically accurate at the enterprise level. But it did not capture the full picture of what China as a whole was absorbing across all its import channels. The emergency meeting that matters happened not in a foreign ministry briefing room, but inside the National Development and Reform Commission, where the people responsible for China's energy security architecture were being asked a question that had no comfortable answer. What do we actually do if this does not resolve in 4 weeks? The answer they arrived at was expensive, incomplete, and would take years to fully implement. It was also, according to one source, described by a senior official in the room as something that should have been started 10 years ago. Why did the United States do this? Follow the strategy, and the answer is clear. The American blockade of Iranian ports was not primarily about Iran. Iran was already economically devastated before April 13th. The blockade was about sending a message to every country that had built a strategic dependency on Iranian oil, primarily China, that the United States was willing and able to impose costs at the infrastructure level, not just the diplomatic level. It was a demonstration that American military dominance in the Persian Gulf is not theoretical. It is operational, and it can be activated against Chinese supply chains without a single American and Chinese soldier coming into direct contact. This shifts something fundamental. Before April 13, 2026, the American and Chinese rivalry played out largely through trade policy, technology restrictions, and Taiwan-related tensions. There was always an implicit understanding that the global energy system was a shared infrastructure that neither side would weaponize completely, because doing so would hurt the entire world economy, including America's allies. That understanding is now gone. What China is being forced to confront is that its energy security model, which Goldman Sachs analysts estimated exposed only about 6% of China's total energy consumption directly to Hormuz disruption on paper, was far more vulnerable in practice because of the specific refinery configurations, the specific tanker routes, the specific contract structures, and the specific financial instruments all built around the assumption that the strait would be open. Historically, what analysts will call China's Hormuz dependency problem was not a secret. The IEA's executive director, Fatih Birol, described the broader global situation by saying that the entire $110 trillion global economy can be taken hostage by a couple of hundred men across a 50-kilometer stretch of strait. For China, that vulnerability was always larger than for most because of the Iranian crude dependency on top of the general Gulf dependency. The legal situation is also significant. Multiple international law experts have pointed out that neither the United States nor Iran actually has the legal authority to close or impede transit passage through Hormuz under international law. The United States has essentially declared that its military capability supersedes the legal framework, which is a statement with implications that go far beyond this specific crisis. If American naval power can blockade a strait that international law says it cannot blockade, then the rules China has been building its long-term strategy around are not as stable as Beijing assumed. Here's the domino effect from this point forward. If China's Hormuz exposure remains structurally unresolved, Beijing will be forced into a massive acceleration of energy diversification spending that was previously being done gradually and cheaply. If that spending accelerates, it means Russian pipeline capacity, Central Asian energy corridors, African oil investments, and domestic renewable build-out all get funded simultaneously at emergency priority levels. If all of those move simultaneously, China's energy import bill goes up dramatically in the short term, even as the long-term dependency decreases. If the import bill rises while manufacturing costs are also rising due to expensive energy, Chinese export competitiveness weakens at precisely the moment when American tariff pressure is already squeezing it from the other side. India is watching this very carefully. New Delhi has spent years trying to reduce its own Gulf energy dependency and is now watching Beijing scramble through the same crisis India has been slowly preparing for. Indian analysts understand that a China that is energy stressed is a China that is strategically distracted and that creates room in the geopolitical space that India has been trying to enter. Japan and South Korea are also calculating. Both countries rely heavily on Gulf energy. Both are American allies. Both are watching Washington demonstrate that it is willing to use the energy infrastructure as a strategic weapon, which means that American allies in Asia need to make very careful decisions about which side of that weapon they want to be on when the next crisis comes. Where is China's response? So far, it has been verbal. Beijing has called the blockade dangerous. It vetoed, along with Russia, a UN Security Council resolution on April 7th that would have authorized military force to reopen the strait. It has not yet taken any action that directly challenges American naval enforcement. Reports from diplomatic sources describe a Chinese leadership that is calculating very carefully whether any direct confrontation over Hormuz is worth the consequences, and concluding, at least for now, that it is not. A leadership that is building a public posture of outrage while privately accepting that it does not have the naval power to contest the United States in the Gulf in 2026. The psychological toll on Chinese energy planners, the people who spent careers building the model that is now cracking, is being described by sources familiar with internal communications as profound. The question being asked in those circles is not just how to get through the next few months. It is how a country of 1.4 billion people, the world's largest manufacturer, the world's largest trader, went this far into the 21st century with this much of its industrial base dependent on a single choke point it could not defend or control. The tanker routes from the Middle East to China's eastern coast used to take a certain number of days. Now they take that number plus 10 to 14 more, traveling around the southern tip of Africa, burning more fuel, paying more in insurance, arriving later costing more. That extra distance is not just a logistical inconvenience. It is a daily, measurable tax on every unit of Chinese industrial output that depends on that oil. And it is a permanent reminder of what happens when a great power builds its economy on geography it does not control. You can negotiate trade deals. You can build Belt and Road infrastructure across 3 continents. You can become the world's largest manufacturer, the world's largest exporter, the world's largest holder of foreign currency reserves. But you cannot manufacture geography. You cannot build a factory that produces Strait of Hormuz alternatives in a quarterly earnings cycle. So where does China actually stand right now? Beijing holds more than 1 billion barrels in strategic reserve. It is drawing those reserves down carefully. It is rerouting tankers around Africa at enormous cost. It is scrambling to activate alternative supply corridors through Russia, Kazakhstan, and Angola. Its refineries are adjusting to different crude grades at reduced efficiency. Its foreign ministry is issuing statements. Its navy is absent from the Gulf, and its leadership is sitting with a calculation they cannot escape. The energy model that powered 40 years of Chinese growth has just been stress-tested by American naval power, and it failed the test. As we move through the coming weeks, expect Beijing to try to push for a diplomatic resolution through back channels, not because it wants to help Iran, but because every day Hormuz stays disrupted costs China approximately what its entire space program costs in a month. Expect Beijing to accelerate long-delayed pipeline agreements with Russia and Central Asian suppliers. It might try to use its position in global bond markets to create economic pressure on Washington. It could even attempt to offer economic incentives to Gulf states to bypass American blockade enforcement. But what cannot be undone is the demonstration. The United States just showed the world, and most importantly showed Beijing, that American military dominance in the Persian Gulf is a real-time operational capability, not a historical legacy. When the strait reopens, China will not go back to the old model. The cost of going back is now higher than the cost of changing. And that change, the forced redesign of China's energy architecture, the acceleration of its diversification away from Hormuz-dependent supply, will reshape global energy markets, global shipping routes, and the global balance of power for decades. The ships will move again, the oil will flow again. But the map that China has been using to navigate its energy future has been permanently redrawn in the last 2 weeks. And it was redrawn, not in a negotiating room, not in a diplomatic cable, but in the waters of the Persian Gulf by the United States Navy in under 36 hours. Subscribe and stay close. We are monitoring the tanker rerouting data, China's reserve drawdown pace, and the first signals of Beijing's long-term energy pivot in real time. When that pivot becomes visible in the numbers, we will break it down immediately. This is the story beneath the story at Hormuz. And it is just getting started.